In this particular last video for the course, we're to talk about multicultural experience, which of course incorporates, the immigration experience, but also includes an awful lot of, experiences that people have if they live in another culture for some time and then come back perhaps to America. So we found that, adapting to a new culture requires a lot of change, flexibility, things like that. And there's some real benefits to this acculturation experience, one of the largest being creativity. That is to say, it forces you, if when you move to a new culture, you are now going to see that. In fact, very, 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 it's just silly, but just bear with me, okay? I remember my freshman year in college, day one, moving into the dorms, and my roommate was from Green Bay. That was 50 miles up the road from my house. So up from Green Bay, and I saw that he folded his socks different than I did, and I was like, I never thought that there could possibly be more than one way to fold a pair of socks. Now imagine if you're talking about larger things as well, how to solve social conflict, how to much larger things than just folding socks. It's just amazing when you get the more experience you have, the more you see that there's more than one way to do things. Okay. And so the key was creativity. So many, many, many artists and writers have had multicultural experience. And in fact, many of the most famous works of art or literature were created by people while living in a foreign country. However, acculturation is not always good because you often pick up the habits of the culture that you are moving to. And so if you are an immigrant and you are particularly good at acculturation, so technically, you you've got a good job, but you are living in a bad neighborhood, that implies you're going to pick up the bad attitudes of the neighborhood you grow up in. And so here's a pretty visual of it. You see, here's the obesity rate of recent immigrants, obesity rate of long-term immigrants, and obesity rates of average Americans. I bet you this graph is way old, but I'll bet you the trend is still there, but this number's got to be higher. But the trend, the story is still true. Well, when it comes to multicultural people, there's two basic ways to think about the way that they juggle two or more cultures, and that is by blending and frame switching. So blending is the idea that you will take your two cultural worlds and sort of merge them into one cultural or one identity. Frame switching says you have two cultural worlds that are independent from each other, and when necessary, you'll draw on this one, and when necessary, you'll draw on this one. Okay? So we see here that for blending, here's some evidence. As a rule, that the self-esteem of Westerners, or in this case Canadians, is quite a bit higher than the self-esteem of Japanese people. And as you can see here, Japanese people that move to Canada, if you measure them after 7 months, the Japanese moving to Canada have a much higher self-esteem. Whereas Canadians moving to Japan have a much lower self-esteem. So it's clearly this notion of blending together these two identities. Or in an even cooler one, here's another self-esteem study, and it was East Asians that moved to Canada. And so what they looked at was a whole different degree of levels of Japanese acculturation into Canada. And so you can see here, the self-esteem on the far left is Japanese people that have never left Japan. The second one is Japanese people that have in fact been abroad. Third one is recent immigrants from Asia. The fourth one is, and you can see here, by the time you get to third generation Asian Canadians, you've got a self-esteem that is equal to the standard Euro Canadian self-esteem. However, it's not always about blending. There is this idea of frame switching, which is the idea that it's pretty clear with language that you don't blend them, although you do get elements of blending two languages. It's fairly common for immigrants to perhaps speak something of a Konglish, a Korean and English combination, where they're kind of mixing words from both languages in together. But generally not. Generally, you're speaking one or the other. So you're frame switching. That is to say, when you're in this context, you do this language. When you're in that context. Now, there's some evidence that this is also true in other contexts. So, say for example, the sociologist who describes the behavior of African American youth from the inner city as having almost a frame switch. That is, two identities that they use, the code of the street and the code of the good, the code of the decent, rather. And it's like, when you're in this context, you should act in this way. When you're in this context, you should act in this way. Okay?